Our lecture series is named after the Mosse family, who have had a significant influence on cultural and public life in Berlin, in Germany, and Europe since the late 19th century. The Mosse family's success story began in 1867 when Rudolf Mosse founded the so-called Zeitungsannoncenexpedition, the newspaper advertising expedition in Berlin. His idea of accepting advertisements from businesses and individuals and then distributing them to relevant newspapers worldwide resulted in the company's rapid growth. Just 5 years after its establishment, the company had over 250 branches in Germany and abroad. Mosse's business model, with which he conceived a kind of precursor of today's platform economies, was so successful that he built a veritable publishing empire from Berlin. With several daily newspapers, especially the Berliner Tageblatt, and over 130 journals, the Mosse family created a liberal democratic fourth estate within the German Empire. However, the family was expropriated and expelled in 1933, not only because of their political orientation, but also because of their Jewish faith. Over the following decades, many of Rudolf Mosse's descendants who had emigrated would follow him in his philanthropic efforts, such as setting up pension funds, creating foundations, or building orphanages. Others pursued academic careers. For example, George L. Mosse became a prominent historian, writing about German Judaism, Nazism, and the history of sexuality and masculinity. In 1997, George L. Mosse and Klaus Scherpe founded the Berlin Mosse Lectures, an interdisciplinary lecture series designed to promote public discussion of current political, scientific, and cultural issues. After establishing several branches of the lectures in the USA, as well as in Amsterdam and Jerusalem, the lectures are now coming to Vienna. Given its rich Jewish history and its location at the intersection of Eastern and Western, Southern and Northern Europe, Vienna is an excellent choice for the lectures. We would like to thank the Mosse Foundation in Berkeley most heartily for financing this venture as our main sponsor, and the city of Vienna for providing local financial support. We have taken our motto of bringing the lectures out of academic spaces seriously and are delighted to have the privilege of using the Red Bar as our venue. A very big thank you, therefore, also goes to our cooperation partner, the Volkstheater. The Mosse Lectures tackle a new overarching theme each season and invite speakers from around the world who would otherwise be difficult to attract. However, we have suspended our originally planned first topic because the world seems to be in turmoil. The rise of populism in Europe, Trump's re-election, the massive war crimes and systematic massacres in Ukraine and the Middle East, and the Western public's often contradictory and hypocritical responses have led us to inquire about the condition of the so-called fourth estate, die vierte Gewalt. This institution of critical self-observation and informal power control is essential when the three formal powers or estates, legislation, jurisdiction, and the executive, erode. However, it itself seems to be under threat from erosion. It comes as no surprise that the fourth estate is being eliminated as an independent, critical power in autocratic states. However, its massive loss of significance and influence, even in workable democracies, makes the overall political situation all the more alarming. In a party and lobby-driven state, under economic pressure from new information markets and competing with the fifth state of social media, the press and traditional mass media have clearly lost their independence and critical impact. In addition, classical public intellectuals, once the defenders of the public interest, are now seen as advocates of the status quo, reinforcers of state-supporting common sense, or mouthpieces of dubious elites. Thank you. This development is not purely political in nature, of course. Rather, it has more to do with the media of public discourse. In the 20th century, public discourse was controlled by institutional gatekeepers of the Fourth Estate. It was limited, exclusive, and delivered or broadcast top-down. But the gatekeepers ensured some orderly public discourse with regulated verification procedures, with universal claims to truth, organized archiving institutions, and accountability for both journalists and politicians. However, in the age of peer-to-peer networks and social media platforms, it is algorithms that regulate access to information. Procedures of justification and regulated recording practices have become just as marginal as claims to truth and personal accountability. This has given rise to a departure from public discourse and its socially binding and connecting effects. Instead, countless communities are emerging that are held together only by shared skepticisms or beliefs, by mere opinions, or even emotions. Here, perceived and believed identity always takes preference over reasoned and questionable knowledge. Therefore, institutional erosion and epistemic collapse go hand in hand. But there is hope. In recent years, new ways of creating knowledge have developed, perhaps taking on the role of the former Fourth Estate. Information policy initiatives have emerged to counter disinformation based on populism and conspiracy theories. Unlike classic modern journalism, these initiatives use decentralized peer-to-peer networks that no longer rely on clandestine sources and secret informants. Instead, they combine investigation with activism. They use open source intelligence, mainly digital sources such as freely available information, social media images, and satellite data, to expose state and corporate violence, war crimes, and genocide. Moreover, they carefully document their research methods so that anyone can follow them. And they willingly share these methods. Finally, their work is journalistic in the broadest sense because they publish and archive their information. Research agencies such as Bellingcat and Forensic Architecture have undergone what could be called a forensic turn. They now apply former police investigation methods to uncover state, economic, or military crimes. They bring scattered fragments of digital or material information into a public forum for review, producing knowledge rather than mere facts. And lastly, they hold all parties involved accountable by collaborating with NGOs such as Human Rights Watch and Syrian Archive, as well as national and international courts. Eliot Higgins has identified 4 complementary areas of expertise among these organizations. Bellingcat, which he, as you know, founded, conducts online investigations. Forensic Architecture uses digital modeling techniques to visualize and expand evidence. Human Rights Watch draws on such data and material to enforce human rights. And Syrian Archive secures reports and documents for the future. Another notable organization would be Memorial. Established during the Perestroika era, this Russian NGO is still active in an international network today. Memorial combines multiple research projects with the fight for human rights and the preservation of memory. Last but not least, the role of the public intellectual has changed in line with today's conditions. The intellectual is no longer an advisor on universal questions or a guardian of common sense. Their expertise is now more limited, yet more specific. For example, they identify the new political, technical, and economic parameters of public discourse. They name its fictional substrates and describe its effective conditions. This winter's Mosse lecture will feature all of the aforementioned expertise. In January, our guest will be Josef Vogel, who caused a considerable stir with his study of contemporary platform capitalism and its plutocratic and autocratic underpinnings. In December, Gaby Ivans, a former member of Syrian Archive and current head of open source research at Human Rights Watch, will give a lecture, and this will be followed by a discussion with Stefanos Levidis, co-director of Forensic Architecture in Athens. In mid-November, we look forward to welcoming Irina Sherbakova, a founding member of Memorial and winner, amongst other awards, of the Nobel Peace Prize. The reason why our speaker today can only be present virtually will be explained by Szilvia in a moment. In any case, I'm very grateful to Eliot for delivering the inaugural Vienna Mosse lecture. Many thanks to Barbara Tóth, who will be in conversation with them afterwards. And of course, thank you all for coming.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Szilvia Gellar, and I too am part of the team that organized this event. A warm welcome to all of our guests. We are truly grateful to have found a home for the Vienna Mosse lectures at the Volkstheater, which is accustomed to and attracts a critical audience. While organizing these lectures over the past 2 years or so, we explored several topics that would be suitable for a kickoff, as Burkhard already mentioned. However, the more recent global political events made it clear to us that certain issues are particularly urgent and we would like to address them. Today, the constitution of truth depends to a large extent on the possibilities of digital technologies and the dynamics of social media, and of course on people who use them both skillfully and responsibly. This is the arena in which a new mode of investigative journalism operates, whose role in shaping a critical public discourse could not be overstated. That's why we invited Eliot Higgins, whom you certainly know as a citizen journalist and founder of the investigative journalism collective Bellingcat. Eliot has, for example, proven the use of cluster munition and chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war. With Bellingcat, he uncovered the role Russia played in the downing of Malaysia Airlines MH17 in 2014. They identified the actors behind the poisoning of Sergei Skripal and his daughter in 2018. In contrast to more traditional investigative journalism, Bellingcat works with open source intelligence, that is, with publicly available information which they collect and compile from a variety of sources, such as YouTube, Instagram, Google Earth, TikTok, and so on. Sadly, Eliot was unable to accept our invitation to join us in person this evening because staying in Austria and in Vienna proved unsafe for high-profile Bellingcat members. This fact alone raises many questions. For us as organizers, it raised also the question how we could give the event a presence that would ground it in a meaningful way. So we were and we are very excited that Dr. Barbara Tóth has agreed to participate. As a journalist and a historian with a PhD, Barbara has a fascinating profile. She is a senior editor at Falter, focusing on media, politics, on the interconnections of both, and on contemporary history. She has received several awards for her work, for example, for her thorough investigations of the mechanisms of propaganda and disinformation that led to the defamation of the editor-in-chief of Süddeutsche Zeitung last year. In addition, since the beginning of this year, Barbara has also been on the board of Reporters Without Borders in Austria. With this profile, she's the critical anchor for this evening. And let me give you a quick overview about this evening. First, we will hear Eliot's lecture about disordered discourse for about 45 minutes, followed by a discussion with Barbara together for about 20 minutes. After that, you, dear audience, will also have the possibility to ask your questions. This part will be moderated by Barbara. So enjoy the evening. Thank you very much. And dear Eliot, dear Barbara, we are very happy to have you here and looking forward to hearing your voices. The stage is yours.
So thank you for having me at this event. Thank you for the introduction. It's quite a period that we're going through at the moment. I often do events like this where I ask the audience, how many people know someone who believes in something that's a conspiracy theory? And generally, I'll get about 80% of the people putting their hands up, and that has got increased over the last few years. I'm often the target of conspiracy theories, as is Bellingcat. There's all kinds of tales out there about me, about Bellingcat. And through my work on things like chemical weapons attacks in Syria, the downing of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 in Ukraine, and on other topics, we frequently encounter people who believe in conspiracy theories about those stories. But what I'm fascinated by is why that's the case. I've been, since 2006, involved with what you might call the counter-disinformation industry. Not always directly, but certainly among the people working on these topics. And very frequently, the discussions are about foreign interference, especially coming from Russia. Really, that started with the election of Trump in 2016, where there was a lot of finger pointing at Russia for the interference that they were doing with the election. But in my experience, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. So I'm going to take you through some slides that will explain a theory I've developed about why people are being drawn into what I call disordered discourse. So I'll just briefly share my slides. Hopefully everyone can see that. So I started with the question of how do we understand our democracy was the question that I had. And I started that by first looking back at how we came to a common understanding of the world in the 20th century. And I started with the work of Walter Lippmann, who in 1922 wrote a book called Public Opinion. And this book was looking at how public opinion had been formed in World War I, where at that point in time in 1922, there was a lack of faith in the government, in the media, because of the lies told to the American public. And this was felt across Europe as well, and in the United Kingdom, that there had been this betrayal of the public trust. And one point that Lippmann made was that the real world is far too complicated for any individual to really understand. He said the real environment is altogether too big, too complex, and too fleeting for direct acquaintance. And he says really individuals form an understanding of the world by creating what he called pseudo-environments. That by consuming information through mass media, the public creates an understanding of the world. But that understanding is not 100% accurate. It's more of a almost a simplified version of reality. But that simplified version of reality that was mediated through mass media and its various allies allowed there to be a shared understanding of the world. And whilst you may take a different political stance on that or have a different angle, it was broadly the same. The problem is that changed. We ended up in 2007 with this device, which has unfortunately changed the world in both good ways and bad. This is the original iPhone. And when this was launched in 2007, there wasn't an awful lot of social media. So this is the number of users various social media platforms had. So, for example, the QQ platform, which was a Chinese social media platform, had 201 million followers. You can see fifth from the bottom is Facebook with 26 million followers. But after the launch of the iPhone, there was a huge spread of social media use. You can see within a few years that Facebook goes from 26 million followers into 1 billion followers. And this is enabled by the spread of smartphone technology, that the development of apps on these platforms allowed for a huge spread of social media. And this created a situation where no longer were we just receiving information through one mass media lens, we were sharing it, getting it shared through lots of lenses. And this was dividing us into our own pseudo environments that were designed around basically what we wanted to see. And there's a mechanism behind this that creates what I call disordered discourse. So this model of disordered discourse is something that I use to explain to people and help understand what's happening when we're encountering disinformation, conspiracy theories, and other craziness on the internet. And it's made up of 4 dimensions. First is the elements. These are the kind of fundamental particles of disordered discourse. Then there's the drivers, why people share disordered information. The agents, who are the people actually doing the sharing of this information? And finally, the discourse itself. How is that discourse actually created and developed? So we can start with the elements. And these elements were established by a researcher called Claire Wardle. The first is misinformation. So it's very important to be clear about the difference between misinformation and disinformation, because often the 2 terms are used interchangeably, and that's actually quite damaging for the discussions around this, because misinformation is false or misleading information that is spread without the intent to deceive. That's information that the person sharing it believes is true, but is in fact false. Then you have disinformation, which is false or misleading information that is deliberately created and spread to manipulate, deceive, or mislead. So this is when people are choosing to share false information for their own reasons. And finally, malinformation. So malinformation is true information, but it's manipulated or framed misleadingly. So you can picture this as emails that are leaked, but only selected emails are leaked and framed in a certain way to push a certain agenda. We then have the drivers, and there's many drivers of disordered discourse, and you can categorize them in 3 ways. The structural and technological drivers. So that includes things like algorithmic amplification or monetization incentives, the fragmentation of the information ecosystem itself. The psychological and social drivers can start with cognitive biases, doctrine enforcements, crisis catalysts, identity reinforcements. And this is actually something that's often overlooked, because these communities that form around disordered discourse aren't just a bunch of people who agree on the same things. It's actually a process where it's almost like a cult-like process where people are drawn together and they have these shared psychological and social drivers. And then you have the political and economic drivers. So some of it is weaponization by state and political actors. Sometimes it's the failure of policy and legal regulation of the platforms. Sometimes it's just people trying to make money off these platforms. And to give you an example of what those drivers can be when they're not always about disinformation, I want to show you a example of Hoof GP. So Hoof GP is a guy in Scotland whose job it is to drive around cleaning and caring for the hoofs of cows. And he has a YouTube channel that has 2.48 million subscribers. He gets a very large amount of traffic to his channel. It's actually a channel I watch. For some reason, I find it relaxing and interesting, but that's probably because I'm weird or something. But what's crucial here is that if you click on enough of these videos, you start getting recommendations for other channels from the algorithm. And that's what I started to see, things like this channel, Cleaning Hoof Action. The thing is, in these videos, the hoofs look really horrible. I've blurred them for a reason, because they're covered in maggots, worms, they've got nails in them. And there are quite a few of these channels like this one. But as you can immediately see, there's a very obviously AI-generated header image here. They've also misspelled John. And there's another example of this one. This is actually a Vietnamese web channel that has started posting these videos. What these actually are fake hoof videos. These aren't real cow hooves. They are, well, they are, but they've been actually cut off the cows already, because what they were doing in an attempt to capture the algorithmic recommendations from the Hoof GP, they were creating fake videos where they went to a butcher, got the leg of a cow, and then dressed it up in a way that made it look horrible, and then they would clean it on the camera. And this was their attempt to capture the algorithmic recommendations. Why? Because in Vietnam, where these videos were coming from, the average monthly wage is about $400. But if you get 1 million views on a video, that's worth more than $400. And some of these videos did reach that level. In fact, more recently, thanks to things like Google VO3, for example, we are now getting videos like this. These are all completely AI-generated hoof cleaning videos that are mimicking the hoof GP videos. And these are now quite easy and straightforward to make. So you're now moving to this, you don't even need to go out and buy the cow hoofs. You can actually just make the AI video content of it and post it online. So that's just one example of how these algorithmic and monetization incentives leads people to create fake content online. Now, that's obviously not political content, which is often the big concern, but it's just a way how behavior is shaped by these incentives. We then have the agents of this sort of discourse. So I say there's 4 main groupings of agents that we can think about. The first are official state, political, and government actors. So these are governments who lie to the public. There's lots of those, not really needing to give any examples of those. But then you have the proxy state, political and government actors. So we can think of these as covert actors. So things like the Internet Research Agency, who produce propaganda on behalf of Russia, or the overt ones, for example, Press TV, Russia Today, even some cases where there's captured media, for example. You then have the self-interested actors. So these are the people like the guys making these fake hoof videos who have their own agendas. And these can be from like grand agendas of trying to make money and build up an online reputation for themselves. Or it can be something quite simple. It's someone seeing a funny video about someone they don't like and resharing it. All of that is, the same thing, but on different scales. But at the center of all of this are the true believers. And these are the people who really believe this stuff. These are the people who, when they're sharing this false information, are really sharing misinformation because they believe it's true themselves. And often in the past, when we thought about disinformation, we think of it in terms of these other actors tricking the true believers into believing stuff that's not really true. But really, when you look at these systems, it's usually a combination of these acting with and against and towards each other. And that's something that needs to be considered when we're talking about foreign interference, for example. There needs to be people to be influenced to actually really believe this stuff anyway for this to be effective. Otherwise, it's just a circle of liars lying to each other. So you can actually use this model to see how this works in practice. Now, there's this guy called Jackson Hinkle on Twitter, and he's a big influencer who has an interesting background. When he was a student, he was an environmentalist. He became a Bernie Sanders supporter, and eventually he's become what he calls himself now, which is a MAGA communist. But he produces a lot of false information that gets a lot of engagement because he realizes if you produce emotionally engaging content, then people are going to click on sharing that, and it doesn't matter if it's true. And last year, he was invited to the Donbass in Ukraine. And this was part of a press tour that the Russian government had organized. And they brought various bloggers and journalists to be given a tour about what a wonderful job they were doing freeing the people of Donbass. But after this, he was invited by Russia to the United Nations. And this is a video that he published. And when you watch this video, just listen to how he describes the traditional media.
We're here at the United Nations about to give a brief presentation, do some Q&A with the mainstream media about a recent trip to the Donbass. My first time here. It's going to be pretty cool, so be sure to tune in. I'm going to be sharing all the links and everything, but I'm sure the mainstream media is not going to like what we have to say.
So then this video was published online. This is a live stream from one of the UN press rooms. And what's important here is, for the Russians, is that Jackson Hinkle is sat in front of lots of UN logos.
I want to share my experiences from my recent trip to the newly liberated territories of the Russian Federation in the Donbass. My journey took me to Mariupol, Tokmak, Berdyansk, Melitopol, and the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant over my 7-day trip, providing me with firsthand insights that starkly contradicts the lies and the narratives that have been propagated by the mainstream media and the Western political elite here.
And this footage was then used by Russia Today. And when you watch this clip, just look how Jackson Hinkle, who is just a guy off Twitter, basically, is described by Russia Today.
As Western powers ship seemingly countless billions of weapons to Kyiv, its media has failed to fairly cover the Ukrainian conflict, including the dangers brought on by America's involvement. Now, that's according to a group of legal and political experts who addressed the UN after a trip to observe the conflict zone.
Most shockingly was my visit to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Several points of critical infrastructure at the plant have recently been compromised by Ukrainian drone attacks and shelling.
So what's happened here is a process where a self-interested actor, Jackson Hinkle, is approached by an official state actor. He's given a press tour and then invited to the United Nations by that same actor to give a press conference, which, as we can see, was sparsely attended. But the whole point of this is to get footage that can then be used on Russia Today to promote the idea that the West is lying and this is a political commentator, not just some random Twitter user, who is now able to reveal the truth. So it influences those true believers. And this is actually a tactic that's used repeatedly by Russia in various circumstances. For example, with the white helmets in Syria, they had some anti-white helmets activists do that exact same process. But that is how all those different actors interact to influence those true believers with their own agendas at each point. Now, disordered discourse actually evolves through stages. It doesn't just happen. And we can look at it in this way. First of all, you have questions. Everyone has questions. And you go online and you start looking for answers to those questions. Now, you're going to start engaging with content online, and that engagement is going to be fueled by those drivers. Now, those drivers could be that you don't trust the media, you don't trust the government, and you're very likely then to find websites, algorithmic recommendations that reinforce those ideas. And that draws you into a group, and that group has an identity. It can form as part of the discourse, it can already exist as you're joining a group, but that could be that we're the anti-vaxxers, we're the anti-white helmets people, so on and so forth. And as that group kind of grows and creates a community, it creates institutions within that community, kind of parallel institutions to traditional institutions. So certain websites, bloggers, semi-official groups become the people who are defining the group's dynamic, the groupthink itself. And that ends up with a situation where you have discourse absolutism, because what happens is when you join those communities, you start being drawn into communities that police what information is allowed to be part of the discourse within those communities. That if someone says, well, actually, I think maybe vaccines do work and they don't activate 5G microchips, then you'll be forced out of those communities. And that then becomes a lens through which you see the entire world, because that network of websites, that community becomes the lens through which you see the world. And you end up kind of, again, as I showed at the start, kind of a splintering of people into different communities, these kind of bubbles we often hear about. And we can see an example of that with a study that was done by someone who looked at how people were drawn into QAnon. They asked people on various forums where QAnon hung out, exactly how did you get drawn into QAnon? First of all, it usually began with a distrust of the establishment for some reason. It didn't have to be one thing. It was a whole range of different things. It could be people who heard about the New World Order, or they didn't like Obama or the Clintons, or they were someone who was a former hippie who got drawn into it, or maybe the Gamergate story. It didn't really matter. It was really just about forming that distrust, because then they often encounter a crisis which codifies that distrust. And that leads them to find, basically do their own research online, going to those pre-existing communities where they hear about these stories. And there's various anecdotes where people explain these. There's one here, for example, where they say that 9/11 was the seed. They call it the Israeli art project in the Twin Towers, and they describe Obama as the Kenyan being elected as another key moment in this. And it's the same kind of pattern again and again. You have the distrust that's then codified by this crisis, and then they go online and do their own research and find those pre-existing communities. And you end up with people like this who are storming the Capitol on January 6th. The internet is also a really great filter, and it also acts as a filter when you're engaging with this disordered discourse. So, imagine it's a few years ago, you're a bit worried about vaccines, you're hearing about these COVID vaccines, and you wonder if they're safe, and you Google it. And the first answer you get is having vaccines all at once might be a problem. This is something that's actually come up again recently with RFK Jr., but you might think, well, that doesn't sound completely unreasonable. And depending on the drivers of your kind of distrust and the algorithms that are recommending content with you, you will be shown other answers, that vaccines can make you sick. Now, you may or may not choose to believe that, and that might be a point where you hop off, but there will always be a subset of people who will click those links and engage further with the algorithms and engage further with the communities. And now they're seeing information that vaccines are designed to make you sick. And you click on that, and now you're getting information that Bill Gates wants to put microchips in you with vaccines. And you click on that, and suddenly you'll believe that 5G is going to activate the microchips. But not everyone's going to go on that journey, but there will always be a subset of people who are vulnerable to that for a variety of reasons. And this has real world consequences. This is a news report from the UK where 77 cell phone towers were burnt down because of the 5G conspiracy theory. So this is real world consequences. And you don't need 10,000 people to believe something. You only need 10 people who are motivated enough to go and do something like this to believe it. It's also worth looking at the actual structure of these ecosystems. There was a really great piece of work done by Kate Starbird, which resulted in this very complex looking diagram, which I'll try to explain to you now. She took a selection of posts from Twitter over a period of time that mentioned the white helmets, and then examined them for sentiment, whether or not they were anti or pro white helmets, and looked at the websites that were in the domains that were sharing them. Now, what you're seeing in this bottom corner with the pink are mainstream news outlets sharing an article from the AFP wire service about the white helmets. And what you're seeing with the round circles is how many times an article was published on that website, which isn't very much. So you have this kind of small cluster, but then you have this big cluster, which we can zoom into here. This is really what you could see as an echo chamber. So these are all websites that portray themselves as being independent and alternative media and offering contrary perspectives to the mainstream news and views. They're made up of those proxy state actors like Russia Today, for example, but also true believers in terms of sites like 21st Century Wire, for example, who are known for spreading conspiracy theories. And here the circles are larger because what that represents is more articles that are sharing negative sentiment about the white helmets that are then shared or republished in part by the other websites. So what you're actually seeing here is websites citing each other's publications again and again and again, creating what might seem to someone within that network as lots of different sources, but really it's the same stories just being recycled by the same websites, often with different spins or different people talking about it, but basically the same stories over and over again. So it creates an illusion of a rich media environment when really they're just getting the same information from bouncing around this echo chamber that they're in. But it doesn't just stop with people forming these communities of disordered discourse. You end up with something called institutional capture. So that's the process by which disordered discourse is absorbed into the core functions of power, be that the government, media, or other institutions. And this is something that I think we can see clearly happening in the US at the moment. It's something that, in my belief, is almost one of the natural states of discourse online because of the algorithmic incentives that prioritize engagement over the truth. And to give you an example of this, I want to go back to several years ago and the Dominion voting scandals. And this is a video from Fox News that was very, very hard to find because most of this stuff has been scrubbed off the internet now for reasons that will become clear.
Welcome back. I'm back with Sidney Powell, who is part of President Trump's legal team in contesting this election. Sidney, we talked about the Dominion software. I know that there were voting irregularities. Tell me about that.
That's to put it mildly. The computer glitches could not and should not have happened at all. That is where the fraud took place, where they were flipping votes in the computer system or adding votes that did not exist. We need an audit of all of the computer systems that played any role in this fraud whatsoever.
So this is a claim that was spread by Sidney Powell through right-wing MAGA-aligned media in the US that Dominion voting machines were used to fix the US election. And this is something that President Trump himself started posting about when he saw it on Fox News, and it became the kind of accepted truth within that MAGA community. The problem is it's complete nonsense. As many of you will probably know, that Dominion sued Fox News and others over this and won the case. And how this story actually entered, political discourse is a good example of how institutional capture works. First, I just want to take a look at some of the quotes from the court documents about the source of this story. So it says, what was the evidence for these far-fetched claims that Powell sent on the day before the broadcast? An email entitled Election Fraud Info Powell had received from a source, which the author herself describes as pretty wackadoodle. This email alleged Dominion was one common thread in the voting irregularities in a number of states. In addition to promoting lies about Dominion, the sender claimed that Justice Scalia was purposely killed at the annual Bohemian Grove camp during a week-long human hunting expedition, that former Fox News CEO Roger Ailes, who died in 2017, and Rupert Murdoch secretly huddled most days to determine how to best portray Mr. Trump as badly as possible, and that the author continued, "Who am I, and how do I know all this? I've had the strangest dreams since I was a little girl. I was internally decapitated, and yet I live. The wind tells me I'm a ghost, and I don't believe this." So this was the entire source of that Dominion voting story. But what happened here is this classic case of how institutional capture works. So first it begins with an institution being exposed to an idea. And in this case, it was the idea that the election had been rigged. That's then led to the alignment of incentives with the actors who are involved with this. So the person promoting the idea has their own agenda, their own incentives, that the Fox News has its own incentives, but they align for different reasons. They don't have to agree on what the truth is. It just has to be in alignment with what their incentive is. And then it starts being integrated into the narrative of that institution, that suddenly you've got Sidney Powell being shown on Fox News talking about this stuff, that the hosts start nodding along and saying, oh yes, this is very serious indeed. But that starts actually capturing the behavior of these institutions. In the case of Fox News, there's emails where they were so worried about Newsmax capturing this story and running ahead with it that they kept inviting Sidney Powell on again and again and again. And then finally, it becomes embedded into the structure of the organization. They start making decisions based off that disordered discourse. And this has a really negative problem, because now what we're seeing in the US is that these disordered discourses, things around anti-vax community, the Pizzagate conspiracy theorists like Kash Patel, for example, are now actually embedded in the structure of the United States government. And the problem is, because they're working off basically fantasies, that when there's a problem, they distort it, they identify it in a distorted way. And that leads to flawed solutions being implemented because it's based off a distorted problem identification. And when that fails, the problem they have is in these communities of disordered discourse, this loyalty to the groupthink is punished. So when it does fail, they have to deny it was, something they did. It's not our fault. It's the liberal media, it's the Democrats. And then they externalize the blame, and that further radicalizes that in-group. And it creates this cycle where we see in-groups becoming further radicalized against out-groups. And I think we can see this happening regularly, unfortunately, in the US all the time. So that just gives you a sense of kind of where we are in terms of disordered discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliot Higgins. That was very interesting. I would like to start by briefly addressing the situation in Austria. Austria is considered to be at risk of tipping into illiberalism or even authoritarianism, even though we have prevented a Chancellor, Herbert Kickl, this time. But in your opinion, is Austria a progressive or a regressive democracy at the moment?
You can understand what state democracies are in by using a model I've also developed around basically what is a functioning democracy. I look at it in terms of there being three core functions to democracy. The first is verification, that we have processes in institutions where there's an attempt to find the truth, that we create these within institutions. They can be things like the scientific method in universities or editorial controls in newspapers, for example. And then deliberation, that there's spaces in democracy where that deliberation can happen. They can be parliaments, for example, and they should be pluralistic, that we listen to different people and we come to some shared understanding, even if we might disagree on what that exact understanding is. And finally, accountability, that the powerful can be held to account, that action can be taken. And in my mind, those are the fundamental functions of democracy. Now, when we look at democracy, we can actually examine what that democracy is doing. And I would break democracy down into three forms. You can have substantial democracy, where those functions are actually being performed. You have hollow democracy, where you have a kind of performance of those functions, that it might seem that debate is taking place, but it's always about coming to kind of the same conclusion, that verification is often handed off to technocrats rather than it being something that's done through institutions, for example. And then finally, you have simulated democracy. This is what I call a disordered democracy. And this is where it might look like democracy is happening, but really the verification, deliberation, and accountability parts of that are really about reinforcing the power of the in-group. So when you're thinking about your own democracy, you can start asking yourself, in terms of verification, can you find the truth? As a member of the public, can you trust that you know what the reality is? In the example of the US, for example, at the moment, we can look over at, say, the FBI and the recent kind of work that's been done there with the mass shootings, first with Charlie Kirk, and then later the more recent shooting at the ICE facility, where people lose faith in those institutions because they see that verification is being used to reinforce what the in-group wants people to know, for example. So something else to keep an eye out for in democracies is that very frequently what we're seeing is kind of coalitions of disordered discourse, or counterpublics, as I call them. So if you look at the US, what's happened is often you look at the kind of MAGA movement as one monolith, but really what it is a coalition of disordered counterpublics, that you have people who are coming from the anti-vax movement, represented by RFK Jr., the kind of Pizzagate kind of pedophilia fringe movement that has people like Kash Patel involved, the anti-NATO people like Tulsi Gabbard, for example, and they bring to that coalition their voters. We're seeing, for example, in the UK, Reform UK is doing something very similar. You have people turning up and giving presentations at their party conferences who believe in anti-vax stuff. But when the leaders are asked about this, they don't say, oh, I agree or I disagree. They just say, well, it's important to have these discussions, because they don't want to turn away that part of their coalition. Now, when you're looking at Austria and your own democracy, that's what you have to keep an eye out for. When a party starts seeing to, flirt with these kind of conspiracy groups, these disordered counterpublics, and they seem to be building a coalition around it, that's when you need to start ringing alarm bells, in my mind.
Okay, so I would say we are between substantial and hollow right now, more leaning to the substantial type of democracy. Would that be right with you?
The other thing I would warn you about as well is that the problem with the internet algorithms, the way we encounter information in this new media environment, is that it's kind of inclined to push people towards disordered discourse. Because we've moved from this 20th century model where, as Lippmann described, we had these institutions who, while they were imperfect, they perform those verification, deliberation, and accountability functions, to a peer-to-peer, many-to-many model, where we are no longer just recipients of information, we are the distributors of information. The problem is the information we're seeing is frequently being recommended by algorithms, and algorithms are designed to keep us on platforms, and they do that by sharing content with us that is emotionally engaging, not truthful. So the problem is, if you spend a lot of time on social media, you're generally being drawn into a kind of information ecosystem that first is distributed by people who aren't performing a verification function. They're just sharing stuff that they like and they think other people like, and the truth is secondary, and algorithmic recommendations that are based off engagement. And the problem that causes is, unless there is actually a movement to really shore up democracy from the ground up, that this kind of, in my mind, this default state is moving towards this disordered discourse that I described, because algorithms don't care about the truth, they care about engagement. And if everyone is kind of participating in these systems and getting algorithmically recommended content, it's a huge problem.
Since we are in Vienna, Budapest is not far away and Bratislava is just 70 kilometers away. And Prague, it's the same with Prague. The Czech Republic will vote a new government this weekend. So how do you see these countries? How in danger are they?
I think certain countries that you've mentioned do have a slightly higher risk for various local reasons. I think the problem we've got at the moment is actually a lot of countries are at risk at the moment. It's very easy to point fingers at one country or another and say, they're worse than my country or something like that, for example. But you look at the UK, we currently have reform leading in all of the polls. And really, they don't offer anything new to anyone. They're just offering a kind of more racist, nationalistic version of neoliberalism, which most other parties offer anyway. And I think the problem that we have is, it's almost like any party we elect is still operating within a system that's broken, and that we can't ready to admit the democratic systems we live in have been fundamentally broken in the way that we understand them. They are doing 20th century politics in the 21st century information system. And often that leads to centrist parties chasing basically algorithmic outrage online that the right-wing parties tend to be making the most of. And it kind of widens that Overton window where, and we're seeing this in the UK, unfortunately, happen in real time, where the debate becomes kind of increasingly more right-wing and extreme because the whole discourse is being defined by basically algorithms that are serving people the most emotionally engaging content. And there are those parties that take advantage of that very, very well. And there's other parties who tend to be the more traditional mainstream parties who are kind of just floundering around and reacting to stuff and not really having any real core ideology anymore.
You mentioned the dangers of algorithms. Greece is going to implement an app so that social media will be banned for children under 16 years old. What do you think about that?
I've had to struggle with this a bit myself because I do believe in freedom of speech, but we also have to understand that social media platforms are not, a marketplace of free ideas, as they're often portrayed by some people who believe in free speech. They are systems to keep you engaged on their platforms so they can, sell you advertising and make sure that they're making as much money from you as possible. They are systems of extraction, and they're extracting basically value from the user in any way they can think of. So when we're dealing with children as well, there's sometimes, I think, a wrong-headed idea that because kids know how to use tablets or smartphones, that they are savvy enough to understand the ins and outs of how the internet works. But I would actually say with the younger generations, that becomes less and less apparent because in a way, we've grown up with a version of the internet that's really janky. You can see all the problems with it, and you've kind of grown up with the debates around algorithms and all this kind of stuff. But if you're 12-year-olds getting their first smartphone, they're very unlikely to have encountered any of those debates. And we don't educate them about this. We don't educate them to navigate these spaces. But I think, in a way, banning social media for under 16s is almost an admission that we failed to actually deal with this issue in a better way. I'm a very strong believer that because we've had this kind of collapse, this flattening almost of that kind of verification process, it's gone from institutions into the public, that the public needs to be taught through education from primary level onwards about how these systems work, about actually using critical thinking skills. And that's not to say we should turn every child into a mini fact checker. That's actually teaching them deeper critical thinking skills, because if we just make this about news and information, then I think we miss a much, much bigger issue that's actually happening here, that the very way we understand the world, those systems have changed dramatically.
Education, you mentioned it. There is this idea of an editorial society. And often when we talk about that, we heard that Finland is on a very good path in being an editorial society, in being fact-checking, in having this literacy, digital literacy. So what can we learn from Finland? What do they do better?
Well, I think it's just recognizing that, I think Finland got a bit lucky in a way, because they kind of approached this from countering Russian disinformation specifically. But the approach they took was about building those skills across multiple subjects. There's actually, in the UK House of Lords, there was a report published very recently where they described media literacy skills. Really, they were talking about critical thinking, but media literacy skills as being a core skill to teach children in terms of preserving our democracy. They really didn't mince their words. They said this has to happen. Of course, nothing has happened, but time and time again, it always comes back to this idea: is critical thinking skills have to be taught to young people. Media literacy is really important. And I also think actually teaching people about democracy is important, not just about how it functions, but why democracy is important, why we have it. Because I think sometimes, especially in the West, we kind of think, well, democracy is one. And over the last 40 years, we've moved into this kind of neoliberal meritocracy where it's really up to the government to kind of manage the country's economy and give us as much freedom as possible to be as successful as possible within the terms of meritocracy. But the reality is that, meritocracy doesn't work. It's the term meritocracy itself was coined as a satirical term in a book about how bad meritocracy would be to base a society around. And we've actually just gone and done that. We've kind of created the worst version of society effectively. And this has really led to hollowing out of those spaces where communities could come together and organize. One thing I write about is that in democracies, when there's a recognition that there's a hollowness or a simulation of those verification, deliberation, and accountability functions, is people create what are known as counterpublics. And counterpublics are things like the civil rights movement in the US, various feminist movements across the world. And they require spaces, structures, systems for that to actually be able to happen. For example, with the civil rights movement in the US, Black churches were a really important space for people to come together. But over the last 40 years in many countries, kind of market logic has meant that actually places like community centers, they don't make money. So you get rid of those. And all these kind of spaces where people could come together, union halls, for example, have disappeared. And instead they've been replaced by online spaces that give a simulation of engagement, when really, as we all know, that it doesn't really create strong counterpublics. So what we need to do as a society is actually create opportunities for those kind of counterpublics to form organically. And that has to be, understood in terms of actually a healthy function of democracy, because without that, we have disordered discourse and disordered counterpublics forming almost as a kind of organic outcome of our current information system.
Well, there's counterpublics, but there's also legacy media that plays or can play quite an important role. But how can we finance media that delivers quality?
Oh, I mean, this is a question I wish I could answer because we struggle with this all the time. It's a huge problem because, I know from my own experience, you spend a long time producing a really thoughtful piece, investigative piece, you publish it, it gets no views, and you see the next post in your feed is some stupid garbage someone's produced that gets 10 million views. And it's like, you just can't meet that same demand. It changes the way as well traditional media behaves in online spaces. If you look at sites like the Mail Online, which is one of the biggest English language news sites, you see them constantly churning out articles that intended to engage with the algorithm. But they've got journalists who are basically sat in the office scrolling through GoFundMe pages, Reddit threads, looking for stories basically to write up, rather than real journalism being done, because that's how you survive as a news organization. How you actually have investigative journalism that can turn a profit and be sustainable is really, really difficult. It's something that is often relied very, very heavily on funders from a range of different backgrounds. For example, USAID was a huge, huge funder of journalism, but those USAID cuts that happened this year were absolutely devastating for the independent investigative journalism sector. In some places, it's like I was speaking to a journalist who works with organizations in Central America, and she was talking about more than a dozen news organizations she was speaking to who said they're all shutting down like overnight because of these funding cuts. Now, Bellingcat's fortunate that we have, we don't rely on that kind of funding, but we are still a very, very rare case. And people suggest things like subscription models, for example, but you need a lot of subscribers. Bellingcat would probably need something like 300,000 subscribers to be sustainable in the way it is, and that's not very easy to achieve.
But what about public media? The BBC here in Austria, ORF, couldn't they be hubs for investigative reporting as well? They are not in Austria, really, unfortunately.
Well, yeah, I mean, the BBC, I think, is in the UK at least, still has a very good reputation across generations, which I think is something that is really, really important as a public service broadcaster. And you see this in other countries as well. Traditional public service broadcasters often have very, very good reputations among the public. I think, though, they're sometimes struggling to adapt to this new information environment. I think in many cases they are very good at playing to their strengths. The BBC, for example, has created BBC Verify now, which is inspired by the work of Bellingcat. It's still operating within the kind of traditional system of the BBC, but it's trying these new ways of investigation, which I think is really important. The problem is that's still led by the corporate approach that the BBC has to news, and that. For me, often, I think as well, one of the issues we have is local media has really died the death across, the UK, Europe, US, in lots of different places. And they were actually really the front line for a lot of really important reporting that was going on at a local level. And that's just been disappeared completely in many areas. I think that local media is something that needs to be supported, but not just in isolation. In my view, what we have to do is build almost kind of networks between traditional media, independent investigative organizations, local community groups and NGOs. Something Bellingcat is doing is we've been working with universities to train them to deliver course material on open source investigation and set up investigative hubs at those universities. And the intent is for those hubs to work on issues that the students are interested in on both a local, national and international level, but also engage locally with those news organizations, those NGOs, and develop networks in those local areas where people can investigate things that they care about. Because I think fundamentally we need to re-engage people as much as possible in the democratic processes, those functions that I described. And I think that can't just be left to trying to recreate the 20th century model of, let's have a local news organization. We need to embed those in the communities in a different kind of way.
That next question might sound naive, but would a public World Wide Web be the answer to a lot of the problems you described tonight? Or is it too late for that?
I think it might be too late. The problem is we're so embedded with the systems that we already use, and they're so embedded with us in a way that it's very difficult to create something new on top of that or in parallel to that that people will switch over to. It's like, what are you offering people? Because believe me, the truth doesn't sell. People don't want the truth. They want stuff that reinforces what they already believe. And if that is coming from the top down, especially, it's very hard to make that change. It has to be something that people engage with. And I would say, again, going back to that idea of kind of local engagement, that's where you start building those ideas and embed them in society in parallel with education. And education that's not just about, like I said, turning everyone into mini fact checkers, but participants in democratic society.
Okay. So what interests me most is how do you or how can we ensure that we reach and educate people in the other bubbles who are misinformed? So how can you reach them? Because I mean, you broadcast something on your homepage, we print something in the Falter, the paper I work with, but is it read by the people that are misinformed? Usually it's not. So
well, the problem is
them.
Once they cross that threshold, once they get drawn into those ecosystems of disordered discourse, it's very, very hard to reach them because they have already decided that they don't trust institutions. And they are surrounded by people who reinforce those ideas and provide them with information to, basically say, yes, you're right, you shouldn't trust them. And, I count this all the time. We can write the best article in the world, but people will still say that Bellingcat is the CIA, you can't trust them, and they ignore it. They create these systems of disordered doubt. There's kind of four ways they do this. So first of all, they doubt the claim. They say, well, that's just not true. And so that's an easy way out of it. They say, well, I just don't believe that's true. If there's evidence, they say, well, the evidence, they doubt that evidence. They say, oh, it's been faked, it's fabricated, it's AI. Or they doubt the process itself. They say, well, the process is corrupted somehow, that those journalists are corrupt, the International Criminal Court is corrupt itself. So they always have a way to kind of have an excuse to disbelieve stuff they don't want to believe. And they're surrounded by an ecosystem that provides them with the information that they need to do that. So once they get pulled into these ecosystems of disordered discourse, these counterpublics, it's really, really hard to reach them. And usually when you hear stories of people being reached in those circumstances, it's because some family member, they've had some crisis and they've had to turn to their family and they're kind of slowly drawn out of these ecosystems because it becomes their entire world. It's not just like, oh, they're picking up the daily newspaper, but they're also looking at stuff on social media. That stuff on social media, those forums, those communities are their entire media ecosystem. So once they've gone past that threshold, it's very, very difficult. And again, this is why we need to start with education with children, not just hope they figure it out by themselves by the time they're 18 and they're off to university and they can be explained why all their ideas are wrong.
You mentioned quite some time the TENS alternative media system ecosystem. I'm also writing about these alternative systems, and I'm always hesitating to call them media ecosystems because they're not media or they don't do journalism. So is there another term we could use, or what's your idea about that?
Well, in a way, the media that they create in that is a simulation, as I said before, of those verification, deliberation, and accountability processes that are usually done through traditional institutions such as the mainstream media, for example. So they are a simulation of these real functions, but the simulation is intended, for example, with verification, to use a selection of facts that are allowed within the in-group, that certain sources like Bellingcat, for example, are not allowed to be cited because that will identify you as being someone who isn't part of the in-group. And ultimately, it's about reinforcing what the in-group already believes. Deliberation always is about coming back to the original viewpoint. That any discussion or debate that's happened is really just about saying a simulation of that so they can say, oh, we were right all along at the end. And accountability becomes about loyalty tests and attacking the out-group. That if you get stuff wrong and you're part of the in-group, as long as you're loyal, it's fine. But if you're disloyal, then you'll be externalized and attacked. So you have to kind of understand it through those terms. So when you're talking about these media ecosystems, that's really what you're talking about. They aren't doing journalism as we understand it, they're simulating those functions.
Okay, that would be my last question. So, and then the floor is up to yours here. It's a question about artificial intelligence. In times today, you cannot ask about AI. So, is AI helpful or a threat to Bellingcat?
When I look at AI, I think really the issue we have is that it creates a permission structure for people to disbelieve reality. So now if you don't want to believe a video is true, you can just say it's AI. I mean, we've seen Trump basically doing the same thing recently with a video that was shown of the White House. And this is, I think, where often we worry about AI tricking people into believing stuff that's not true. But I think really the real risk is it just means that you can never really know what's true. I mean, I've just seen Sora 2 producing videos that are all trained clearly on copyrighted content, but you'd be hard pressed to tell the difference between some of those videos and a real video. And the problem is most people are just scrolling through feeds and they think about stuff for a couple of seconds before moving on to the next thing at best. And if you're thinking, well, I don't know if that's real or not, that's just disengaging you with information. And that's a big problem if that starts happening at a really, really large scale, that either you don't know or you can use it for denialism.
But how do you use it yourself in your work? Or you don't need it at all? Or do you use it for fact-checking or for gathering information? Is it helpful in your daily work or not so much?
I mean, really, it's kind of like sometimes I'll be sent stuff and I need just a really quick kind of sense check. And we get a lot of odd emails sent to Bellingcat. Sometimes they're borderline. And it's on a topic you might not be familiar with. And something like ChatGPT Deep Research is actually quite good for like bringing up some links related to stuff. So something like that it's just kind of saves me time. But it saves me ignoring an email versus actually bothering to pay attention to it, for example. I also use it when I'm kind of gaming out certain ideas and concepts, because things like the memory in ChatGPT can be really useful to refer back to documents and stuff I've looked at. But in terms of research, we don't really use it. We have been experimenting using the kind of visual recognition for geolocation. We've published a couple of articles on that, and they're not bad. They certainly aren't perfect, but the thing with geolocation, if something can save you, 6 hours of work, then it's worth giving it a shot in the first place. And if it's wrong, you're back to the drawing board anyway. So there's a possibility that might be useful in the future, but it's developing so rapidly that it's hard to predict where, it might become useful next.
All right, thank you very much, Eliot Higgins. Maybe applause. Thank you. And now questions from the audience are very welcome, and we hope there are some. Maybe we can turn the light on so Eliot sees this beautiful red bar we are in here in Vienna. Are there questions? In the back, I think we have a microphone that can be helpful now.
Thank you for your lecture. One question, how can one be sure not to be in an echo chamber that you described before?
Did you hear it, Eliot?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it can be difficult. You kind of have to, it's useful to be aware that these things happen and that they exist. I mean, even with myself now, I'm very careful about when I'm looking at a topic I may not be familiar with, thinking about how many sources are actually talking about this, who are they citing? I mean, it's often thinking about when you're reading stuff, how are they citing different sources? Are they even bothering to cite different sources? Or are they just stating things as, a known fact? Because that's usually where you can start kind of unpicking stuff. But I think the challenge, of course, is most people don't really want to read an article and then spend a day unpicking whether it's true or not. You have to kind of, for me, start looking at who is a kind of trusted network of sources that you use to get information from. and that also be aware of people criticizing those sources and be open to that criticism, but also at the same time have enough knowledge to actually assess that criticism to see if it's actually legitimate, because everyone criticizes everyone on the internet. So it's very, very tricky.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, there's another one.
Thanks. I was really struck by you talked a lot about bringing sort of the online engagement back into the real world, if I may call it this way, and the work you're doing with Bellingcat, also trying to anchor your work with universities. And so I was thinking if you would say that this is in general something that media institutions or similar institutions have to do more, sort of create their own community, not as an abstract community in the way that you showed us in the beginning, this big lens which is broadcasted, which is sort of abstract, but have to sort of do community work. Is that something that you think even traditional media have to do more to sort of actively create that community in the here and now and in the real world?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one thing we've really lost over the last few decades, are those community spaces that were so important to really bring people together around topics where there was this shared concern. And we have to take real steps to restore some of that. But it's a real challenge, because it's not like you can just go out and start a community center and have loads of people turn up to it. You have to look at where you can create these kind of hubs. It could be universities, for example. It could be kind of local media engaging with their communities in a more direct way. But understand that having online spaces and purely operating in that doesn't really kind of meet the moment in any substantial way, that you need people to meet face to face, talk to each other. I mean, even something like this event today is part of that. So yeah, real world communities coming together, I think, is something that's absolutely essential as part of this. And we need to think about how we encourage that to happen.
Another question?
Thank you for participating online in this lecture. My question is, what are the dangers for organizations like Bellingcat that maybe even present in Austria, the reason why you couldn't show up today? What are the dangers? Thank you.
Yeah, so specifically with this case, it relates to, in terms of Austria, is one of our colleagues, Christo Grozev. He worked a lot on Russian spies. And he was spied on by Bulgarians working on behalf of Russia for a couple of years, and that includes operating inside Austria. There's also a Austrian person who was involved with that. I'm not sure I can actually name for legal reasons, but there are various threats like that that do exist in certain countries. But there are other kinds of threats at the moment. I mean, there's, for example, we're taking really, really seriously the threat of the Trump administration towards NGOs. Bellingcat actually recently set up a 501(c) in the US. And there's a real risk now that we could be targeted by the Trump administration. Like other countries I won't travel to include the US at the moment, because I think there is a significant risk to staff members of Bellingcat to actually go there, because we know there are people within the US government who are specifically looking for information on Bellingcat. And we don't know enough to know exactly what their plans are for that, but that is concerning to us, for example. More broadly speaking, I mean, over the years, I think our relationship with Russia has really taught us a lot of lessons about different types of security. So physical security, cybersecurity is something that we do a lot of work around. So yeah, it's kind of has prepared us for this moment in a way, but unfortunately, the fact is that there's a handful of countries that we won't travel to, including places like Hungary and Russia, and the US is now one of those countries.
I would also like to encourage the women to ask questions. Are there any? No? So I have another question. Maybe there will pop up. Or you have one. Okay, Burkhard, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks very much for your brilliant talk. Maybe another question to the dangers for Bellingcat. I was wondering, is there a danger for your open network of infiltration, so to speak, so that people are entering the network, spying on your current research, even smuggling in false evidence, so to speak, just to discredit your work? This would be one question. Another one would be, what do you think about, let's say, if you think of America, states' investigation and research with the help of Palantir, for example? Do you kind of observe this, or how do you judge this? Because there are some maybe similarities to your work, but of course from the completely other side in a way.
So on the first point, I think, yeah, I mean, I think it would be easier to kind of explain maybe how we organize our community. It's kind of like an onion structure, I would say. So at the center, we have Bellingcat, the organization, and our employees. So, these are our staff members. We know them well and how, who they are and how they operate. We then have a community of trained volunteers, the Bellingcat volunteer community, which is about 100 people. And these are people who've been screened, and they operate on a platform we have called Atlas. They have their own Discord server, and they're kind of trusted volunteers. Now, if one of them started posting stuff that was, dodgy or didn't seem true, it would become apparent very, very quickly. The thing with open source investigation, you're often dealing with pieces of information within a network of information that's interconnected. So if you try and insert false information into that, it doesn't connect to other information in a way. It immediately looks alien to that network. So it's quite easy actually to spot that stuff. So we also have like another layer of that, which is our public Discord server, which has about 30,000 people on it at the moment. And that's more of a kind of moderated space for people to come together who are interested in open source investigation and Bellingcat. And there will be some investigative stuff that comes out of that. And we've published articles based off work that's been done there. But again, it's very hard to insert false information into that environment because you have lots of people who are checking if it's true or not. So it's actually quite difficult to trick open source investigators who actually are paying attention, because it's never about one thing. It's about a whole network of information. And that's information that's can be, satellite imagery, stuff that's been filmed on the ground, fire detection, satellites, marine traffic tracking, all kinds of different sources. And if something doesn't is alien to that, it becomes quite clear. So I'm kind of less concerned about that. I would say in those terms. So what was the second question you had? I always do this.
About Palantir. The research they're doing on,
the way I always see this is that it's kind of like, in my mind, the bad guys were always going to figure out how to do this stuff anyway. And they've always had the resources in terms of intelligence and stuff like that to, use this information against the public in a way. So what we're trying to do at Bellingcat is equip them with the tools, the abilities they need in terms of the public to actually, so members of the public can do this themselves. It's, for me, a form of democratic empowerment, that we're equipping people with the skills so they can find this information. They can take part in that verification process that I talk about, and the deliberation, hopefully the accountability if it's really successful. So it's really, for me, about empowering people with tools and skills and knowledge that would probably be used against them anyway by state actors and other actors.
Questions? So I pose my question. It's really fascinating what you're doing, and I wonder if somebody wants to become one of your researchers. Do I have to be a techie, or can I also be a, historian or philosopher, or what kind of studies or skills do you need?
I mean, really, we have people from a really broad range of backgrounds. Years ago, when I was kind of blogging initially under the name of Brown Moses, the first person who kind of approached me and started sending me stuff to do with the phone hacking scandal in the UK, which is a big thing when I started. She ran a guest house in the countryside of Devon and just was really interested in this particular topic and had done all the reading on it and was obsessed with this topic. You need more kind of obsession more than any other skill in the world, but we create guides, case studies. In our articles, we write how to do the processes, not just because we're showing off, because we want people to learn how to do that themselves. So you can kind of pick up those skills, and you don't have to be, doing an entire investigation by yourselves. The one thing that's really great about our Discord server is you have people who have different bits of knowledge coming together and contributing to kind of solving the problem that everyone's trying to figure out. So it might be someone comes along and they've got a lot of knowledge about a specific kind of type of arms and munitions, or someone who's really, really good at using ship tracking software. You don't need to have one complete set of skills. You can just be really good at one thing, just be part of that community. So that networked effect can be really, really powerful in that way.
And is it more men or more women?
It's more women than you would imagine, but it is definitely still a lot of men. Definitely, I think we do attract a certain type. But yeah, I mean, we've actually tried really, really hard over the years to include as many women as possible. Like when we've been running workshops and training sessions, we always try and make sure there's a lot of women in attendance, and because you have to take those steps to actually make sure there is that kind of equality in terms of who's doing it, because it's not just about having a nice 50-50 split because it makes you feel good. It's so that issues that affect women disproportionately can also be studied and analyzed. One really big topic we've been looking at is deepfake pornography and how that affects women, and having kind of a woman's perspective on that is a really important thing to have, and it's a topic that may not have otherwise got a lot of looking. So you really have to kind of put in the effort to make sure you have a kind of really diverse representation, not just because it ticks boxes, because it means that there's more stories that are being investigated that otherwise would be ignored.
Okay. I see no other signs. So let me pose one more question. Or Burkhard, are you? Szilvia, from you? No? So what, maybe as a final question, what's the biggest threat to Bellingcat right at the moment? So what is your biggest
concern?
threat?
Yeah, I honestly think it's what's happening in the US at the moment, because the US has gone really, that whole disordered discourse thing I talk about pushes stuff towards authoritarianism, and this is exactly what we're seeing in the US, that anyone who's considered a part of the out group is going to be attacked. And like I said before, there are people within the administration who know who Bellingcat are, they don't like Bellingcat, and I've already been looking into how we're funded and those kind of things. And now we've got that presence in the US, that creates quite a significant vulnerability for us. So I mean, we've been having meetings with lawyers about this to make sure that we're as protected as possible, and there's still a huge amount of risk, because the thing is, the Trump administration doesn't really care about the law, and when you're dealing with a situation like that, it makes it very, very hard to predict how you can defend yourself in those circumstances.
Okay, well then I say thank you, and I suppose, Burkhard, you will speak the final words. As host.
I'm not prepared for this. Yeah, thanks again on behalf of the whole audience for your talk, for the discussion, and hope to see you again here in person, maybe next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.